WarsawJS.
I'm Damian Dulisz. You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, and yeah, that's about it. I'm mostly working on the within the core team on the news.vuejs.org newsletter, which also has a website. And you can tell I'm reusing the slide since I haven't been updating the slide since 2019. And right now we just hit the 191st issue of the newsletter, which is pretty great. I think if you are not a subscriber, but you are using Vue or you're interested in Vue, you might want to go there. So just one more time, that's the address. So I also do some open source work. So yeah, if you use Vue, you might know those libraries. If you have any issues open, well, don't mention that on the in the questions. Because yeah, that's rude. So one of those is Vue Multiselect Validate, which is a validation library which just recently received support for Vue 3 and Vue Global Events in collaboration with Eduardo San Martin Morota, aka Posva. I'm also a big fan of dogs, so as you probably noticed, yeah, somewhere there. So this is Bento, like the box of food. As you can see, he likes to blink, and if he's not sleeping there, he's sleeping under the disk. So yeah, that's him. And because I love dogs, I also work at a company called Chorus Dog, because obviously where I'm a technical lead. So this talk is going to be about composition API, which is one of the major and I think the biggest or most impactful addition to the Vue API. But first, before we go into like what it is, I think we need to cover why we need it, right? So right now, there are a few composition patterns or methods to share some code across different parts of your application, right? So there are mixins, there are higher order components, and scope slots. Higher order components never really picked up in Vue like they did in React. So there's mostly focus on mixins and scope slots. For those of you that haven't been using Vue, and I will not be explaining every details on Vue because, well, I guess you had the time to prepare for that before. So first of all, mixins. They're pretty straightforward in that, and this is the, yeah, I think you see my hand. So, and you can see my mouse. Well, that's also okay. So on the right side, you can see that this is the declaration of a component. So it has the data, which is like the local state, the mounted hook, lifecycle hook, the destroyed lifecycle hook, and methods. And all of that is exposed, well, except for the lifecycle hooks, exposed to the template of the component. And a mixin literally follows the same structure as a component. And the way you can use it, you can mix it into an existing component by the syntax at the very bottom, which is like the usage in another component. And it's gonna simply, well, not simply, because there's an like algorithm on how to, or strategy, how to merge those properties into your existing component. So it's very easy to use. It doesn't really create any additional components, but there are some cons to that, namely namespace clashes, because like if you have an X and Y properties in the mixin and you want to have those two on the component, well, the component will override it, but you might already know that it will break the way the mixin will work, right? I mean, you probably shouldn't call those properties X and Y to begin with, but yeah, who am I to judge? So the other problem is that once you use mixins, and especially if you use multiple of those, you don't really know where those properties came from unless you do like a search, like, hey, from which mixin is it? So it's not ideal. And it also doesn't really allow you to share templates. So not great. Then we have scoped slots. And when we talk about sharing functionalities, where we don't really care about template in that case, we usually go for renderless components. And yeah, I guess that's also something that is present in React. So by the way, if you're using Vue, you can raise a hand on the chat. So later on, I will be able to see whether there were actually people that know Vue, and I'm not just producing myself, and people won't really, it won't be very useful for them. So anyway, scope slots as renderless components. So the new thing, or maybe not really new thing, but the uncommon thing for beginners in Vue will be the render method that you can see at the end of the component declaration, which is returning the default scope slot. And this is very similar to React, where you pass arguments, and then those arguments, as you can see at the very bottom, within the with mouse component, the template with the v slot is kind of like a function where the properties that you expose within the render function, they will be accessible here. So, and yeah, that's pretty good because as in the pattern itself is pretty good because it keeps the logic local. It doesn't leak to anywhere else, so there are no namespace collisions. The source of the variables or methods, because you can expose not just the properties like X and Y, but also the update method if you want, are also very clear, because you need to take those within the vslot syntax at the very bottom. And yeah, those could be composed together. So you have a with mouse here, and you could put a with keyboard with, I don't know, camera or whatever, nested together. And it's still gonna, you can mix those together where you pick some properties from one of those, pass it somewhere else, and so on, without having to worry that, there might be some collisions. So if you want to rename a property, you just use JavaScript to rename that. But there are some cons, which is every time you do that, every time you create a renderless component, you create a component, which involves creating a new component instance, which has some performance costs, right? So, if there are any questions right now, I can't really see the other screen because I use the whatever helper from Keynote. So, but I will try to get to those a bit later. So, the other con is that you can only access those properties within the template. So if you wanted to use X and Y somewhere within your script tag of that component that is using this with mouse renderless component, you can't really do that. So that's not great. So this is actually where Composition API comes in, where we take the simplicity of mixing. I hope so. I guess you can grow up to grow up, yeah, probably, but at some point. But if you grow to using it, it becomes quite simple to use. So at first it might not be that, but generally it becomes second nature later on. So the idea of Composition API, it is kind of similar to React hooks. But there are a few differences, which I will get into later on. So I think you can start thinking about it as hooks for Vue, but better. But of course, I'm biased, so of course I would say it's better. Yeah, obviously. So here, some very, very basic things. Vue now exposes several methods that allow you to replicate the behaviors that you would normally have within a component. So for example, you have the reactive method, which you can use, which is very similar to the data function that you had within a component, which allows you to create some reactive state or reactive object in this case. So here's a basic example where you can see where we want to create a store where we pass reactive, where we call reactive and pass an object. And this object will be transformed into a reactive object using proxies for each of those properties and so on. And the good thing is it can be used outside of a component. So if you really want to create a store where you want to share that store out between different components, kind of like global state, well, that's literally the code that you need, except maybe you need to export the cons so you can import the store in other components. Then reacting to changes. So the next method is the watch. Watch works very similar to how it works within the old options API or the default options API in Vue. And the function here accepts, well, 3 arguments. Here we are just going to take a look at the two of them, which first is either ref, which we'll get back a bit in a moment, or a function that should return the fragment of the state that you would like to observe and react to. And then you have the callback that should be called whenever that property has changed. So in this case, we want to watch the counter, and whenever the counter changes, we want to console out, that it has changed, right? So that's pretty straightforward. Then we have reactive primitives, because reactive assumes that you will pass an object, and you have to pass the object around, because if you were to pass like this counter property somewhere, you would pass it by value instead of a reference. So to tackle this problem, we introduced something called a ref, which is like a reactive reference, which can be used for any type of data structures, like objects, arrays, but also for primitives. And the benefit of using a ref is that you can, it's going to create like a wrapper object around it, which has this value property, which actually contains the value of the reference. And then if you want to mutate that, because Vue is all about mutations, you just have to do like counter.value and then assign like a new value to it, right? Yeah, and a reference will be a common theme later on. So computer properties. And computer properties underneath are also refs. So if you would like to create a new computer property, it accepts either a function or okay, it works. So it accepts either a function or an object with a get and set methods. And in here, like, we have a counter which starts with 0, and then we need from the function, we need to return the value of the computed. So then whenever the counter value has changed, the computed won't really update right now unless it's being used somewhere. Oh yeah, my headphones just disconnected, so if anyone said something, but probably didn't because it's remote. So yeah, okay. Anyway, next one, we have refs and watchers. So, and let me just validate whether I'm still connected. Oh yeah, I think I am. Good. So a watcher can also, instead of, like I mentioned, instead of a function, it can also accept a ref. So if you want to watch a reference, we just pass the reference. If you want to watch a computed, we just pass the computed there as it is, because it's a ref that can be observed by a watcher. If you want, you can observe multiple multiple references or refs, where you just pass as the first argument to the watch, you pass an array of of references, and then the callback will receive an array of arguments that like mimics the properties or the references that you are observing. Okay, so we covered the data part and reacting to data. So the other part is lifecycle hooks. So from Vue, you can also import functions that will execute when a component is when that lifecycle hook executes within a context of a component. And of course, you can't really use those outside of a Vue component. So yeah, be mindful of that. So altogether now, there is a new thing in a Vue component, which is called setup. And it basically replaces almost everything within a Vue component, except for components and props. So here is an example that you, I think seen previously, where we translated the mixin or the sculpt slots example into composition function, or actually not yet composition functions, just into composition API within a component. So here we declare a reactive state for the mouse position. We declare a function where we update that mouse position, set up unmounted and undestroyed lifecycle hooks to add and remove the event listener, and then we return that object, the reactive object, on the component, actually. So whatever you return from setup becomes available on the template, right? And the good thing with composition API is that you can just take the code here and just move it into a separate function. And but you might ask, like, hey, but what happens with unmounted or undestroyed? Like this, the context of the component is being inherited, so that shouldn't be a problem. As in, it's not a problem. So later on, if you want to use that that piece of functionality in your component, all you need to do is just import that function, call it, and you can pass any argument that you want, like any refs that you created in setup and so on. And then just return whatever value that you want to expose on the template on the top right here. So, and you can of course use composition functions inside composition functions, and so on, which is very good. So this is where that goes. So very easy to use, no additional component instances, no namespace issues, because you can rename those properties as you want. It's very clear where those variables are coming from. And if you are using composition functions within composition functions, well, you don't really want to leak those. So it doesn't really matter where it originally comes from, right? So yeah, like I said, very high composability. Difference from hooks. Well, Vue components are mostly stateful components. So there is that. The major difference is that the setup function is only being called once. And I guess that's why, because it's a stateful component. So, and because we are operating on reactive data, once it's returned, all the watchers are set and everything keeps updating whenever you modify a property. And because of that, because the setup function is not being called every time the component has to re-renders, there is no issues with the call order. And I think that's something in hooks to look be aware of, where if you were to put a conditional around a hook, it could break some caching. I think something related to use state. I'm not a React expert, so please correct me if I said something wrong. I have a very basic project, and as you can see, I really like dogs, so it's going to be about dogs. And I'm using something called Vite, which is a very nice development tool. So if you're using Webpack, move to Vite because it's just so fast. So yeah, 700 milliseconds before it started. So I think that's pretty good, although it's a very small project, but it shouldn't matter because the way it works, it's not really dependent on the size of the project. Well, not gonna talk about Vite here. So although it's very fast, hello WarsawJS, and I know it's very, I don't know, 2015 to be excited about hot module replacement, but yeah, I'm still am, because it's just so it's instant. And it's instant also because it technically just uses ESM modules and just pigs the file as it is, as in the browser uses it directly. So it's like you were to edit the like you just dragged an HTML file into the browser and edited it directly. So there is no like compilation of like whole bundles and so on. Except like in this case, it's a view file, so it's gonna be compiled on the fly whenever the browser asks for it. And I was supposed not to talk about these, so here it goes. Anyway, so here we have a component, view component, options API, classic, local state, computed property, or a watch, and some methods. Should be pretty straightforward. It's view tree, so you can, as you can see, I don't really need to wrap the whole thing into a div, which I think is a accessibility benefit, as was already mentioned in the first talk. So yeah, and this is what the application does. It just fetches random dog pictures, which is a good thing to have, right? So yeah, I can type something, and yeah, well, if it fails, then we know it fails. Well, let's just go. I don't. The breed of Bento is not really here, so it was a disappointment. But yeah, was too lazy to prepare another demo. So, oh yeah, I was using a composition API as a plugin over a year ago, and I confirm its greatness. Yep, I'm using it for like more than a year, and it's just awesome. But yeah, you will figure that if you try it. So let's extract that into a composable, right? So yeah, this is what we have here, and let's translate this component into the. I can probably do something like this. So let's translate that component into a new well, how it would look here. So we do import, and we need a ref. Probably we need a computed. We need what would we need? We need a watch. And yeah, that's probably it. So from view, then we also need the Axios from, I should have copied it, but well, whatever. So export default, setup. And what we need is, well, const data. That's ref no. And as you can see, I always use refs because I think refs are just better than reactive, because you don't really have to worry and you just assume everything is a ref. Unless it's not a ref, but yeah, you will know. Pending ref const error ref no. Oh geez. And then also we need the breed. So let's do const breed ref collie. Okay, and we got that. So then we need the computer property. So let's do the URL thing. So let's do computed, and yeah, gonna do something smart and just copy that thing here. And I can't really do this breed because this is not really as in this is not accessible in setup. It doesn't really exist. It's an artificial thing in here in this component, and like. The instance doesn't really exist within setup yet, unless you use the get current instance, but that's another thing. So yeah, you don't really have access to that. So, but we have breed as an ref, so we just do breed value, and yeah. So we got our computer property. Then we need a watcher. So I'm gonna do URL, and then we need to, I think we also wanted to have it debounce. Do I have used debounce here? Yeah, I use debounce here. So let's do maybe instead of a watcher, let's start with the fetch method. So it's gonna do function fetch, and then let's do. Well, I'm just gonna be smart about this and just copy a fragment because yeah, why not? You might be asking, why not using preter? Well, because preter is frustrating when it formats it the way I don't really like it. And putting like semicolons at the very end, that's very frustrating. And I know you can turn it off, but well, still frustrating. Okay, so we got the fetch method, and we need to debounce it. And this is like super ugly. Like, why the hell would you need to do something like this, right? So instead of like, it doesn't really make sense to put it on the data. So let's do const fetch equals well. Just fetch, and yeah, we have our fetch data debounce, or actually debounce fetch here, and now we can do the watcher, right? So let's do watch, and then pass the URL here, and then do the yeah, I think we just do the bounced fetched here, and we also need to get the immediate part, so we do it here, immediate true, and yeah, then we just return well, the things that we need. So we need the breed, we need the pending, refresh, error, and dog data. So in that case, we don't really have a refresh, so we do refresh, and then it's gonna do fetch. Fetch. I don't think it should be fetch. That's okay, and then fetch data. We also need data. We also need error, and also need is pending. Okay, so we got that. And if I, oh yeah, that's how it works. So with composable, oh, subtrace, no, Jesus Christ. What just happened? Oh, dog data, yeah. This work? Nope. Oh, the bounce is not, yeah, of course. Yeah, so I haven't set up linting here, so that's why I look very lame doing what I do. Oh yeah, perfect. Error is not. Oh yeah. See, that's the issue with online conferences, because like you don't really get the like people shouting like, "Hey, you're stupid! You made a mistake here," which is never nice, but well, helps, right? Especially if you don't set up your tooling, and you can't really hear people laughing, which is the other issue. So, well, it works. Oh, well, thank you for that. Like, okay, so yeah, I typed something, and that's not a bug, or is it? Oh yeah, that's one. Oh yeah, definitely. Okay, so just calling. Anyway, so we just did what we needed, but I guess this doesn't really look that much cleaner, right? So instead of that, we can actually take a lot of the code that we had in here and just put it there. So we need that. We can put it here. We also need that. So well, probably also this. So let's just put it here, and then what we're going to do is return data is pending, error, and fetch data. And yeah, I think that's it. So now it's going to be kind of broken, but that's all right. So yeah, I don't really need computed. Sorry, watch here. I don't really need watch here, and I don't need this. I will need the import use fetch data from use fetch data. So let's call it here. So const, and what we need from here is data is pending, error, and I think that's what we need. And what we need to pass is the URL and the delay, right? So let's do URL 300, and then we need to do something like this. Is it all correct? Oh, I hope so. Okay, cool. So with composable, yep, works perfect. I'm not that terrible after all. So that's like the what we how the composition API works. If you would like to see the renderless implementation, this is how it looks like. And yeah, I can probably share the repo later on the Discord channel. So this is how it would be used. And like that's the big problem, is that like error refresh, you only have access to it here. You can't really access it anywhere here, which is less than ideal, right? But some fancy things, because like people are looking at this like, oh my god, this is so terrible. That's like ugly. It's not even JavaScript, right? I mean, it's HTML, but it's not even JavaScript. So let's move to JavaScript, Jsx, which is not JavaScript, by the way. But you can use that too. And I'm not going to write Jsx because it's so frustrating, especially if you don't use it. But I have it copied somewhere here, so I could do it with everything. But I figured like, hey, I'm gonna act like a pro. So yeah, and you can use the use fetch data, and if instead of returning the object with the data or like everything that should be exposed to the template, you can just return a function that's going to be a JSX or a render function. You can use actual JavaScript and render functions, but yeah, you can use JSX for that. So for React fonts, it also works. Except, refresh doesn't work. Well, maybe it's not great after all. So bug. Cool. Why doesn't it work? Refresh. Oh yeah, maybe. I don't know. How does it work? Maybe something like this? Maybe something like this? Oh. Nope. I don't know. This is frustrating. Maybe like this. Nope, definitely not. Well, I don't really know JSX. I just use it barely for like some higher order components, actually. So are there any Svelte fonts? I don't know how to say that. Well, so there is also a thing that you might not know within Vue, which is a special syntax. And it looks like this. So you do script and you do setup. And well, that's the magical thing. So after you do that, you can, well, let's make it work, right? So I just wipe that console. Here it is. Import, and let's import ref, import computed from Vue, and then let's do import use fetch data from data. And then what we're going to do is const breed. Why don't I just copy it from here? I don't know. Okay, well, let's just do that. So we have our stuff here. And then what we need actually is, well, I guess I don't think we need anything more because this should work. Oh, gosh. Does it? Huh. Oh, yeah, I think I just need to rename because it's dog data. So just dog data. And yeah. Oh, yeah. Is pending, and I need to import the fetch method and call it refresh. Okay, Svelte fonts. Okay. It doesn't work either. Refresh, const. I think I just, oh yeah, fetch data. Obviously, that's why it wasn't working here. Well, let's do it here. Yeah, that's what happens when you, well, oh, works, perfect. So here, let's go back to this example. So even less code. There's some magic in here, but yeah, I hope. But I mean, if you use Svelte, you don't really care about magic, right? So yeah, here, enjoy. And I think that's it. Where is the presentation? Here is the presentation. I'm just going to do something like this, play in Windows. I don't do this track on the side here. So, well, thank you. This is where you can find me. There is a sponsor link if you want to sponsor. Very much appreciated. And yep, that's it for me. Thank you. Any questions? Do we have time for questions? I don't know.
Thank you, Damian, very much for this talk. I laughed my ass out.
That's good. That's my job.
Thanks a lot for that. So I think Svelte fans were very happy when you mentioned that they don't use logic. Okay, well, okay. We have a lot of questions. So let's see one of them. Yeah, for example, Gone Drone. So you can extract parts of Vue functionality without a component. That's cool.
Is this a real question, though?
It's actually no, it's an observation.
Yeah, so I know. That's true, and it's very useful. Like, it literally makes building any type of like I don't know, like stores or like validation libraries and all of that very easy because, well, you are not bound to a component. So if you want to build a global store like a Vuex clone, something completely new like Pina, it's like so much easier to do compared to Vue 2, where you had to create like hidden Vue component instances, like with new Vue, and then hack around with the a bit clunky syntax, which was designed for Vue components, but not really for like plugins. So yeah, it's a big plus, and I think you can use it in other situations also. Like I think even on server side, if you wanted that, but well.
Okay, and then now a real question. So what is the difference between passing function and refs as first argument to watch?
So the first argument is like, what's the watch target? Like, what should we observe and react to, right? So if you pass a ref or an array of refs, like this is gonna be what you will be observing, right? Whereas if you pass a function, it's more about like in a computed property where you have and maybe yeah, that's not I mean that's important, but like not right now. So you have a computer property, right? And computer properties, whenever they execute, they collect all of the maybe I haven't asked like whether this was big enough. So computer properties, when they execute, they collect all of the dependencies, right? So when this executes, within the context of this function execution, it collects breed as its dependency. So whenever breed changes, there is a subscription that like it lets the computer know like, hey, I'm changed, you're dirty, and like whenever something like asks your value, you have to recalculate. And this works exactly the same within a watcher. So if I were to do something like, hey, here's a function, and let's do like an if statement, if X, then return Y, or well, Y, and then I'll return Z, right? Depending on whether X is true or not, you would register always two dependencies, always X, and then either Y or Z. So technically, this is a bit more flexible because it allows you to have a watcher that conditionally depends on, well, the dependency list that was there when the watcher target function has been executed last time. So it's pretty useful if you want to like switch target and like you don't really want to watch that property anymore and you want to create watch another one. Of course, the watch function returns on watch. So if you want to stop a watcher somewhere else, you can just do on watch. I mean, this wouldn't really make sense because it would just execute once, and if you remove that, it wouldn't execute any at all. So yeah, that's the main difference. So yeah, if you know specific properties that you want to watch, you can do like URL, and then you also want to watch the error, and yeah, that's how it would. That's what you can do, and it would makes it very easy to like tell what you're watching.